All right, then I believe I should start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Spani. I'm the coordinator of the Medieval and Renaissance study program. I'm shaken. I'm impressed to see how many students we have here today. It's it's a good thing. I was supposed to say, dear students, faculty, Mars faculty and friends, but I see only students today. So, oh yeah, there you go. No, I'm just kidding. That's right. So thank you for coming. And as many, I'm going to be very brief. And as many of you know, or may not know, in the fall, the Cantor Art Gallery will host a fantastic exhibition entitled Bringing the Holy Land Home, the Crusades, Chertsey Abbey, and the Reconstruction of a Medieval Masterpiece. In preparation for that show, today's lecture is a great introduction for a better understanding to what you all will see in the fall 2023. So let me first introduce the director of the Cantor Art Gallery, and then our speaker, just in order of appearance. The director of Cantor Art Gallery is Dr. Meredith Fluke. She is the director of the Cantor Art Gallery, where she has recently shepherded the move of the gallery's program and the collection into the new Performing Arts Center. At the Cantor, she has curated a number of exhibitions, including Kevork Murat, Memory Gates, and A Mirror to the World, 2 centuries of collecting at Holy Cross. Prior to Holy Cross, she was a curator at the Davis Museum at Wesley College and the program manager of the new Center for Netherlandish Art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She has also held education and curatorial positions at the Brooklyn Museum, the Museum of Biblical Art in New York, and the Met Cloister. She received her PhD in Medieval Art and Archaeology from Columbia University, specializing in Italian architecture of the 10th and 11th century. Her academic interests include the development of architectural forms and their relationship to liturgical use and communal identity. Our speaker today, Professor Amanda Leister. She's assistant professor of art history in the visual arts department here at Holy Cross. She has published in journals including Speculum, Word and Image, and Gesta, or Gesta, with the classical Latin pronunciation. She has been awarded fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Philosophical Society, and has served on the board of directors of the International Center of Medieval Art. She has been invited to speak at Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge universities, as well as other institutions from London to Shenyang, China. Her work on the Chertsey tiles and the roles of imported Islamic and Byzantine objects in medieval England is connected to her current book projects, as well as to the exhibition she will speak about today. So thank you for being here. Thank you. We will have now Dr. Luke. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Spani, and thank you, Amanda Leister, for inviting me to say a few words today. I'm just here for a couple minutes. And also, before I start, those of you who are watching on the Zoom webinar, I'm the person answering questions. So please put things into the Q&A, and I will bring those questions to Professor Leister when they come up. So today, Amanda Leister will be talking about Bringing the Holy Land Home, which is an exhibition that will open at the Cantor on January 6th. That's actually the spring of 2023. Don't go next fall, this spring. Before she dives deep into the material, I asked if I could say a few words about the significance of the exhibition for both general and scholarly audiences. So I'd like to say a few words. An innovative approach to the iconic Chertsey tiles, bringing the Holy Land home connects these humble objects, and they're humble because of their material, but also because they were meant to be walked on, to networks of exchange across Europe and the Mediterranean that were active during the time of the Crusades. As audiences will see, these tiles create a surprising entry point into the 13th century, allowing us to explore complex notions around sacred and decorative objects that traveled within crusading networks during the time. Dr. Leister approached me about this project when I first began at Holy Cross in the fall of 2019. I was like a weekend. She had recently finished work on a reconstruction of the Chertsey tile program, which promised to both physically and culturally contextualize the Chertsey tiles and to readdress the two well-known roundels of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin that are almost always on view in the medieval galleries at the British Museum. These famous objects that are used in the museum's Teaching History with 100 Objects initiative have been embedded in British national and larger historical imaginations of the Crusades, with little actual consideration given to their original context, that is the Benedictine Abbey's chapter house, and likely commissioned for Westminster Abbey, which you'll hear about from Dr. Leister, or to the realities of their material or design. Dr. Leister's scholarship has been instrumental to understanding these objects as part of a larger network, which is good scholarship for sure, but doesn't make for a good exhibition. This is the first question that I ask whenever I'm approached with a proposal. With regards to the Chertsey project, the answer is definitely yes. For me, it's the possibility of looking at the tiles alongside objects that also participated in this complex network of trade, where each object will help us to understand the Chertsey tiles and their historical context better. That makes it an interesting project. In addition, as someone with background in architecture and archaeology, I was drawn to the challenge of working with archaeological materials to demonstrate the processes of historical reconstruction. These are the things that we hope will be at the forefront of experience at the gallery. It's important here to mention the enormity of work and resources needed to mount an exhibition like this at Holy Cross. Most importantly, this exhibition takes on loans from some of the most important collections of medieval art in the world. Lending institutions for the show include the British Museum, Dunbarton Oaks, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Morgan Library, Harvard Art Museums, and the Worcester Art Museum, as well as a foundational partnership with the Chertsey Museum and its staff. It's no accident that the exhibition is the first historical object-based exhibition in the new Cantor Gallery, in the new Prior Performing Arts Center. It's meant to exemplify the Cantor's expansive commitment to the core values of an academic gallery, where we aim to demonstrate the rewards of historical inquiry and the efforts of innovation, inclusion, and excellence, and model dynamic curatorial practice. Our mission aligns with that of Holy Cross, whereas in liberal arts institution, we value new scholarship and perspectives and resist deterministic ideas about the past. So today we look forward to hearing Dr. Leister speak about how this exhibition will play a small role in interrogating the cultural landscape of medieval Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean and help to expand our understanding of artistic exchange during the Crusades. Thanks, Dr. Leister.
Thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you, Giovanni and Mars, for inviting me to speak. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize Meredith Fluke for her longstanding commitment to the successful completion of this exhibition. I'd also like to recognize Janice Desmarais in Dinan Library, Neil Smith in Classics, and a number of others, including students, for their substantial contributions. Without them, there would be no reconstruction, there would be no exhibition, and there would be no lecture this afternoon. In addition, I'd like to thank our funders for their generous support. These partners include the Kress Foundation, the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation, the Jaharis Center, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, how do I work this? My aim today is to share with you the outlines of an exhibition I'm curating that will take place in the Cantor Art Gallery in the Pryor Arts Center in spring 2023. This exhibition, Bringing the Holy Land Home, the Crusades, Chertsey Abbey, and the Reconstruction of a Medieval Masterpiece, explores a new reconstruction of a highly fragmented royal tile pavement from the mid-1200s, featuring the English Crusader King Richard the Lionheart, battling the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin. An international team that I've been leading recently completed a digital reconstruction of both the floor's pictorial tiles and the lost Latin texts that surrounded them. In this exhibition, we reveal that the subject of the entire tile pavement is a fictional English victory in the Crusades. In addition, the iconography and composition of the floor are based on Islamic and Byzantine silks, which were brought home as prized souvenirs by English crusaders. Our discoveries show that even the medieval English, residents of an island nation at the western edge of Europe, relied on traditions deriving from far outside their borders to articulate their authority. In addition to the actual Chertsey tiles from the British Museum and our reconstruction of the pavement, the exhibition will feature well-known art objects from the museums you've just heard about. Like the Chertsey tiles, these objects witness the ways in which medieval Europe's visual surroundings were impacted by Islamic and Byzantine traditions and objects. In conjunction with the show, we're publishing a catalog. Apparently it's being printed this week. It's appearing in October. I'm very excited. The catalog contains essays from many noted experts in the field and contains a foreword written by Michael Wood, an English public historian and OBE. If you are of my generation, you may remember him from numerous BBC and PBS documentaries. Also in conjunction with the show, we're hosting an in-person on-campus symposium on March 25th, supported by the McFarland Center, which will host many of the experts who wrote for the catalog, as well as curators from the British Museum and the British National Archives. My talk today has three parts. The first introduces the Crusades within the context of arts and visual culture. Please note that I did not set out to do a show about the Crusades. It was the ceramic tiles that, when reconstructed, firmly instructed me that this was the subject of the story that they relate, and therefore the context within which they needed to be understood. The second part introduces the Chertsey pavement and our reconstruction of the fragmented pictorial tiles and lost Latin texts, and describes its connection to the Crusades. The third part, I share some of the research on other objects in the show that students have completed, including some of the student contributions to public-facing media for the exhibition. Because the Chertsey tiles here feature individuals well known from the historical Crusades, Richard the Lionheart and Sultan Saladin, these art objects bring the history of the Crusades squarely into view. Many people, when asked, would say that the Crusades were medieval wars between Christians and Muslims over possession of the lands around Jerusalem. The Chertsey tiles support this kind of summary. A Christian ruler fights a Muslim one, both isolated and framed as if they're the representatives of their different faiths. Other art objects, however, tell a different story. Here I'm showing you a medieval Islamic enameled and gilded glass that was adopted by an English family. Understood as a souvenir brought home by a crusading ancestor, the preservation of this glass, unbroken and intact, was thought to be centrally important to the fortunes of the family. Hence, this piece became known as the luck of the House of Eden Hall. This Islamic glass suggests the movement of art objects during the Crusades. It also suggests the way that Crusaders treasured objects made by those of different faiths, to the degree that this Islamic glass was understood to hold the luck, the good fate of an English family within its fragile shell. Some objects then, like the Chertsey tiles, foreground violence between Christian and Muslim figures. Others, like the Luck of Eden Hall, witnessed the fascination that Crusaders felt when they first encountered foreign-made objects in the Holy Land, and the degree to which those objects, when brought home by Crusaders, impacted Europeans and their visual culture. The First Crusade was called in 1095 by Pope Urban II. Here he is in a 15th century manuscript, called in order to take control of Jerusalem, the city where Jesus was crucified. Although the Crusades are often understood as a Christian reconquest, when Pope Urban issued his call to arms, hundreds of years had passed since Jerusalem had been under Christian rule. Many of the important cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Jerusalem, had been under Muslim control since the 7th century. From the 7th through the 11th centuries, Jerusalem was ruled by Muslims, but its population practiced many faiths, and European or Latin Christians continued to visit. It was a recent disruption of the balance of power in that region, the rise of the Seljuk Turks, who were also Muslim, that led to Pope Urban II's call to crusade in 1095. The Orthodox Christian Byzantine Empire was threatened by the Seljuks' recent conquest of Byzantine lands in Asia Minor. Pope Urban used the Byzantine emperor's request for aid as a wedge to open up the possibility of Latin Christian ownership of part of the Holy Land. Motivations behind the Crusades were complex, deeply spiritual, and also, frankly, material. Their goal was not to convert non-Christians, but instead to enable the acquisition of sacred territory. Now, the Pope directed those who took up his call to arms to have the sign of the cross made of cloth sewn to their clothing. By this mark, all who encountered them would know their mission. In later centuries, these soldiers came to be known as crusaders, meaning those who had taken or been marked with the cross. And the battles in which they fought came to be known as the Crusades. Between Pope Urban II's preaching of what became the First Crusade in 1095 to the fall of Acre in 1291, the Crusades formed part of a broader military offensive by Western European Christians. Indeed, while many today assume that the Crusades were limited to the Holy Land, the Crusader offensive also manifested elsewhere in the Mediterranean, including on the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, in North Africa, especially in Egypt and Sicily. The Crusades have long been presented and understood as part of a clash of civilizations between Christians and Muslims that extends from medieval through modern days. This phenomenon is addressed by one of our catalog authors, Suleiman Morad, professor of religion at Smith College. He describes how in modern media, in documentaries like the History Channel's 2005, The Crusades, Crescent and the Cross, the BBC's 25, The Crusades, and Al Jazeera's 2018, The Crusades, an Arab Perspective, we hear about, quote, the history of conflict between East and West, the mightiest battle between Christianity and Islam. Or, for thousands of years, the holy lands of the Middle East have run with blood. The deepest wound was made by a war between Christian and Muslim, begun at the close of the 11th century and fought for 200 years. As Morad points out, such provocative language and polarization shock viewers and promote the idea of a clash of civilizations, the Muslim East versus the Christian West. But the Crusades were much more complicated than a clash of civilizations narrative allows. For instance, acts of violence, murder, inspired by crusading rhetoric, took place not only on battlegrounds, but also in towns, cities, and villages across Europe. I show you here a specific discovery published in Current Biology and also circulated on many major news outlets. A DNA analysis of medieval bodies that had been discovered in a well revealed the Crusader era killing of a Jewish family, including 3 sisters, the youngest of whom was about 7. The body of a Jewish toddler was also found in the well. This murder took place not in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in Norwich, England, in the late 12th century. This Jewish family and the others who accompanied them probably met their death at the hands of local Christian assailants in the context of emotion stirred at the beginning of the Third Crusade, 1189 to 92, in which the English king, Richard the Lionheart, whose picture we've been seeing, participated. The violence of the Crusades then was enacted not only in the Eastern Mediterranean, but across Europe, not only against Muslims, but also against those of other faiths, and not only against soldiers, but against families. Neither the Christians nor the Muslims were unified groups in the Middle Ages. This map, made by the textbook company Pearson, shows some of these divisions and not others. Among Muslims, these Seljuk Turks here were recent arrivals on the scene. They were Sunni Muslims, and they had taken over several local Shiite dynasties, leading to decades of infighting over how to divide the newly conquered lands. The Fatimids here were Shiite. The Muslims were also divided along linguistic lines, mainly Arab, Turkish, Kurdish, and Persian. Christian leaders of the Crusades were also divided along linguistic and political lines. They regularly disagreed with each other and with local Christians, including Armenian, Arab, and Coptic North African Christians. There were also other parties involved, like the Eastern Orthodox Byzantines in what are now Turkey and the Balkans. The Fourth Crusade's major victory was actually the conquest of the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, present-day Istanbul in Turkey, in 1204. In other words, a Christian crusader force attacked and seized another Christian kingdom. The Fourth Crusade should make it clear that the Crusades were not just about Christians versus Muslims. There were also many more complicated dynamics having to do with non-religious factors. In the case of the Latin Christians versus the Byzantine Christians, competition to control trade routes also came into play. A map more like this, which we use in the exhibition, shows regions broken down by political rule rather than by faith, which perhaps makes this complex reality easier to see. The false narrative of a clash of civilizations, presenting an oversimplified view of all of the Christians against all of the Muslims, focuses our attention on religious difference as the only salient difference between peoples. It suggests that that kind of difference was insurmountable. It dismisses all other kinds of differences in language, ethnicity, and culture as if they meant nothing. It implies that political and economic competition did not exist. It's this idea of clash of civilizations that continues to shape our understanding of the Crusades because it's simple, it's widespread, and it has rhetorical force. Narratives of the past, even false or oversimplified ones, shape our understanding of the present. When false narratives of the past are used to describe the present, they impact the future. So if, when constructions of the past are inaccurate, that affects us today and tomorrow. Understanding the Crusades in the past as essentially a clash of civilizations divided along religious lines has given and continues to give support to elements of contemporary society, politicians, white supremacists, who seek to leverage division for political or economic gain. Complicating the narrative of a clash of civilizations saps the rhetorical power of those who are interested in perpetuating it today. So the Crusades cannot accurately be understood as a clash of civilizations. They were much more complicated than that. Indeed, the cultural impact of the Crusades across Europe was perhaps both broader and deeper than we might expect, and it was not limited to the military realm. In the context of the Crusades, men and women, knights and priests, rich and poor, traveled, many for the first time in their lives, far from home, over many months to the Eastern Mediterranean. When they arrived, they stayed for months, years, even decades. After the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, in the First Crusade, Crusader kingdoms were established in the Middle East. I'm showing you here a Crusader church built just outside Jerusalem. And the last Crusader kingdom did not fall until a century later. Over the course of this 100 years, people who'd been born in Western Europe learned to live, build, trade, and eat in the Eastern Mediterranean. They then bore children who were arguably no longer Europeans. While living in the Crusader lands overseas, the English, French, and others learned about different ways to build castles and to feast. They experienced different kinds of music, pottery, glass, clothing, and goldwork. Many Europeans loved these new technologies and treasures, and if they went home, brought souvenirs, setting off throughout Western Europe waves of adoption and imitation of defensive military architecture, hand-washing habits at table, and various objects like the Luck of Eden Hall, the populated feast tables, altars, and church treasuries. New tastes for glassware, for instance, in England and elsewhere, were gradually satisfied by extending trade and manufacturing networks in Europe, especially in Venice and other centers that had long and deep contact with the Islamic world. Tastes established in the Crusades shaped new growth in Western European markets and manufacturing in the centuries to come, and some say set the foundations for the Renaissance. In medieval Europe, the impact of the Crusades not only changed the residential and ecclesiastical environments in which people lived, worked, and worshiped, it also changed Europeans' ideas of who they were. It's been argued that the very concept of Europe can be connected to the cooperation that had to take place between troops from so many different locations in Christian Europe during the Crusades, that before the Crusades, there were regional identities like the Frankish in the areas of France and Germany, and the Romans who lived in the general area of Rome. But after the Crusades, one could be a European. Crusader identity was also tied to a sense of one's place in God's plan. When, against all odds, the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they considered it a sign of God's will. In addition, they connected their occupation of the earthly Jerusalem with the eventual arrival of the heavenly Jerusalem and the second coming of Christ at the end of time. The Crusaders saw themselves playing a role in these vital moments in the history of the Christian universe, and they felt changed because of it. The French priest Fauchet of Sept, who participated in the First Crusade, describes the deeply significant changes in the sense of cultural identity that took place. Here he writes, "Consider, I pray, and reflect how in our time God has transformed the Occident, the West, into the Orient, the East. For we who were Occidentals have now become Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank has in this land been made into a Galilean or a Palestinian. He who was of Rheims or Chaltes has now become a citizen of Tyre or Antioch. We have already forgotten the places of our birth. Already these are unknown to many of us or not mentioned anymore." The Crusades deeply changed people's ideas of who they were, and you won't see that, you can't see that if you're only looking for a clash of civilizations. The dramatic success of the First Crusade, in which Jerusalem was taken, was never to be repeated, however, and despite later crusades in subsequent years, the lands held by Crusader kingdoms gradually diminished. After the fall of Crusader Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, objects like relics, textiles, and ceramics from the Holy Land had a different significance in Western European collections. After the loss of Crusader Jerusalem, portable art objects could still evoke the sacred history of the city and its environs, but they also brought to mind the dream, now deferred, of the renewed ownership of these lands by Europeans. These objects conjured a vision of the end of days, grounded in the New Jerusalem, a vision that had slipped through the Latin's fingers, lost but not forgotten. The interwoven qualities of these concurrent realities of the Crusades, polemic-driven violence, and powerful cultural impact, mean that an examination of the Crusades today is an uncomfortable experience. It can be difficult to process both these truths simultaneously. Yet it is essential to develop this more complex, more accurate understanding of the Crusades, because realizing their complexity, that they were both shockingly violent and culturally stimulating, destabilizes the commonly presented but false narrative of a clash of civilizations. My aim is to relate a narrative that's more complicated and more accurate. Violence is part of this new story, but focusing only on the violence blinds us to other significant cultural truths. It is then this second and less well-recognized dimension of the Crusades, their cultural impact on Western Europe, that our exhibition explores. All right, so we're now moving on to the section specifically about the Chertsey tiles, which I know you've all been waiting for, these famous objects. All right, so what are the Chertsey tiles? They are ceramic floor tiles made in 13th century England. They are the most admired ceramic tiles ever produced in medieval England and arguably the most impressive of all European medieval tiles. Yet they were unearthed in the 19th century as a pile of fragments with no tiles in situ and most broken into multiple pieces. While in the 1970s, the British Museum physically reconstructed, they put this back together, these two roundels of the Chertsey tiles showing, as you know, Richard the Lionheart and the Sultan Saladin. The rest existed only as hundreds of fragments in museum storage drawers. In 1980, the British Museum tile curator Elizabeth Eames published hand-drawn black and white reconstructions, these, of the images shown on each roundel. She also published drawings of the remaining fragments of Latin text that went accompanied them. But the incredibly fragmentary nature of the Chertsey tiles has meant that their full impact has not been understood. When I went to the British Museum to see these, they opened the drawers and I was like, what? And they said, yeah, that's the reaction we usually get. It's just a pile of little pieces. Despite that, an international team, which I led, has recently completed a digital reconstruction of the entire combat tile program, including images and lost Latin texts. The texts were fun. Our reconstruction reveals that the Chertsey combat tiles do not simply portray what Eames thought was a series of famous combats. Instead, what we have here is a literary and learned compilation of crusaders and lion hunters, including biblical heroes like Samson, fighting in the Holy Land, all alongside Richard the Lionheart. This series of tile images and texts seems to have been an original composition, emphasizing Richard's fictional victory in the Crusades and employing allusions to other kinds of heroic actions, ranging from lion hunts to juridical trials, many of which take on specific meanings in the Crusades. Because art depicting the Crusades made in the period when the Crusades to the Holy Land were actively being pursued, like 1100 to 1300, because this is surprisingly rare, the Chertsey tiles are even more significant than scholars had previously recognized. The floor shows a fictional English victory in the Crusades, led by Richard the Lionheart. Richard is shown having pierced his enemy Saladin with a lance. Here's the base of the lance, there's the tip. Saladin slumps on his mount. The mount stares at us cross-eyed. However, not only did Richard never best Saladin in single combat, Richard and Saladin never even met in combat. In fact, although they were opponents in the Third Crusade, they never met face to face. The Third Crusade ended with a truce, and Richard went back to France, where he ended up getting killed in a battle with the French king. So this apparent crusading victory is propaganda. It constructs a view of the English king that is advantageous to him, but it is not true. So the tiles focus on Richard the Lionheart and his deeds in the 1190s, but they bore contemporary import for the crusading aims of the English King Henry III about 60 years later, around 1250, which is when these tiles were commissioned. King Henry III, who lived from 1207 to 1272, was Richard's nephew, and Henry has previously been considered the patron of the Chertsey combat tiles. I suggest that they were commissioned instead by his queen, Queen Eleanor of Provence, who lived 1223 to 91, for her so-called Antioch chamber in her rooms at Westminster Palace. Westminster Palace has burned like at least 3 times since the 1200s, so her Antioch chamber no longer survives. I'm instead showing you an old print of Westminster Palace. In this royal setting, the combat tiles would have served as positive publicity, constructing Henry III as the typological heir of his uncle, Richard. Such an heir was desperately needed after the fall of Jerusalem in February of 1250 and the concomitant capture of the French King Louis IX in the Seventh Crusade. These events had created a mid-13th century historical narrative in need of a new Crusader hero. Our reconstruction of the combat tile program also enables us to see that the Chertsey floor tiles witness 13th century English fascination with Islamic and Byzantine silks. Can you see that pointer? Yes, okay, good, thank you. So both the floor's medallion design, so circles arranged in a grid pattern with floral stuff in between and small medallions, both that pattern and the idea that within the roundels you have combats on horseback and against lions, those things all appear in imported Islamic and Byzantine silks. These medallion silks were very expensive, they were technically demanding to weave, and they were very portable, meaning that they were among the most prized souvenirs brought home by crusaders returning from their time spent in the Eastern Mediterranean. I've also identified examples of these textiles in English 13th century inventories, affirming that they were present as artistic models in the very time and place that the Chertsey tile pavement was made. So the Chertsey tiles, which initially seemed to show us only images of Christians defeating Muslims, also, as we can see now after the reconstruction, witness English desires to imitate imported Islamic and Byzantine silks. Until now, English interests in and imitations of medallion-style silks remained unrecognized in scholarship. This is partly because art history tends to focus on architecture and manuscripts. Architecture and manuscripts show less substantial stylistic connections to the Eastern Mediterranean. Textiles, it's a different story. And yet the Chertsey tiles convey an image of English political and religious superiority in the Eastern Mediterranean through a visual composition, medallion pattern, carried by a medium, silk, originally created far outside England. Military and spiritual convictions did not apparently stand in the way of English recognition of the visual power and appeal of the cultural heritage of the lands they so fervently desired to control. When reconstructing the tiles, we went through 3 stages. Stage 1, my team and I completed the photographic reconstruction of individual tiles. Stage 2, we reconstructed the texts. Stage 3, working with the Chertsey Museum, we generated a reconstruction of the floor as a whole, including image roundels and texts, and integrated it with a 3D reconstruction of the entire abbey that the Chertsey Museum has been working on. So 1 image, 2 text, 3 3D. I'm going to show you at this point a 3-minute video that we made for our website. This is one of the points of me speaking today is to sort of familiarize you with a lot of resources that I've already developed. And so these videos are already available on the website. This lays out the first stage of reconstruction, the photographic reconstruction of the tiles. And Brooke Hendershot 23 assembled this video for me as part of her Weiss Summer Fellowship.
The Chertsey tiles are among the most admired medieval ceramics in England. Their iconic pairing of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin is one of the most often used medieval representations of crusading combat, and can therefore be found broadly across both scholarly publications and the internet, and indeed in more unexpected locations, like the cover for a hit single by Kula Shaker. Nearly all these mold-made tiles were discovered at Chertsey Abbey, but the original molds were likely a royal commission, probably for Henry III and Eleanor of Provence at Westminster Palace. The Chertsey combat tiles, and I'm showing you here fragments from the Guildford Museum and Winchester Cathedral, depict scenes of battle within a complex mosaic program. including a number of previously undeciphered Latin inscriptions. 14 different pictorial roundel designs remain for this series of tiles, of which 4 show combats with lions, including one showing the Old Testament hero Samson, and 7 show other combat themes, including Richard and Saladin's duel, archers, and a man who's just been shot in the head. Most of the tiles were unearthed in the 1850s. In the 1970s, British Museum tile curator Elizabeth Eames used these fragments to physically reconstruct 2 roundels. These are the ones still on view in their medieval gallery and on view here in our exhibition. Thanks to this physical reconstruction, the Chertsey tiles have been named the high watermark of medieval tile manufacture and one of the finest, if not the finest, inlaid pavements in existence. However, scholarship on the tiles to date has been limited because nearly all the remainder exist only as hundreds of broken pieces stored in museum cabinets in the British Museum, Chertsey Museum, Guildford Museum, Winchester Cathedral, and elsewhere. Due to the fragmented state of the Chertsey roundels, scholars interested in their iconography have until now relied on the carefully made black and white drawings, completed by hand, published in Eames's 1980 catalog. Using these drawings as our reference, we set out to create photographic composites of each design in the combat series. We constructed these from a series of carefully controlled photographs of the fragments at the British Museum and elsewhere that we took in the summer of 2017. I have a very short video for you here showing our setup. Each fragment was photographed, then digitally isolated from its background, and manipulated in Photoshop so that it precisely overlaps other fragments in the composite image. In this endeavor, much of the image manipulation was performed by Martina Umuna, then an undergraduate at Holy Cross, and Janice Desmarais, our digital imaging expert. We've also incorporated a small number of additional fragments not included in the drawings in the photographic composites. You see in this example, we've been able to add the lion's head, and the photographs also suggest that there may only have been one chevron on the knight's shield, rather than 2. The photographic composites also provide a good sense of the actual appearance of the tiles, rich and complex, energetic, at times graceful, and comical.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so that was stage 1, image reconstruction. Now we move to the text. The fragments of pictorial combat tiles at Chertsey Abbey were found alongside hundreds of fragments bearing text. Yet many more pages of scholarship had been published on the combat series images than the texts. For nearly 2 centuries, scholars like Loomis and Shaw have lamented that it is exceedingly unfortunate that the inscriptions are so heavily fragmented. Many had worked tirelessly in attempts to reconstruct some portion of the text, but reported that it has been found impossible to construct a complete sentence. My attempt is the first to treat the text seriously and to read them alongside the images. In recent years, the study of fragmentary inscriptions has undergone a quiet revolution. In cases where ink has faded or been overwritten, multispectral imaging can reveal the missing letters. In cases where a tablet or stone stele has been fragmented, digital manipulation of 3-dimensional pieces can facilitate reconstruction. Yet the Chertsey tiles fit into neither of these categories. Their text is made of clay, not ink and parchment, and it remains largely legible. And these fragments were never part of a single object. Instead, they were fired as separate mold-made pieces, each of which bears a sequence of up to 4 letters. But it's the relationship of these letter sequences that cannot be immediately determined. The Chertsey tiles then witness an unusual type of fragmentary text. It's perhaps not surprising that until now, no one has taken up the challenge of their interpretation. Yet with the aid of current internet resources and purpose-written computer code, much more can be done with the tile texts. Each sequence of letters is between 1 and 4 characters in length. For instance, FRE, RICA, IA. Many tiles also include punctuation, abbreviations, and ligatures. My initial aim was to determine whether certain text fragments could be combined with other fragments to make complete words. I hoped then to be able to combine words into phrases. I assembled an initial method which entailed 3 tasks. Check each fragment against a compilation, check each word fragment against other extant tiles, check each fragment against Latin crusading texts, check each fragment against Latin vocabulary frequency lists. With reference to crusading vocabulary, Professor Neil Smith and Tess Starshak 17 wrote computer code to assist with the process of comparing Chertsey text to 2 Latin crusading texts written in the 12th century. The computer code, nicknamed Scrabbler, matched any Chertsey string of letters to any words containing that letter string in those base texts. The code was written in Scala and has been made publicly available on GitHub. Using Scala, I drew up table A, which provides a list of complete words designated as highly likely to have been present in the original Chertsey combat inscription. You can see some of the words here. I grow in power or violence, by claw, the spear, the lion, the knight, the king. Having made progress in connecting letter strings into words, I then attempted to connect the reconstructed words into phrases and relate them to image roundels. I began by examining the list of likely words in table A and determining whether any of those words had long-standing connections with any of the named figures represented on the tiles. So the 1970s physical reconstruction of the roundels at the British Museum, while groundbreaking, avoided the unresolved problem of the text and used ornamental tiles where the tiles would originally have been placed. After years of research, I can propose a reconstruction. I first looked for other inscriptions that were frequently used in conjunction with Richard the Lionheart, and I consulted the list of words from table A. An analysis of Richard's Great Seal, which bears the text Ricardus Dei Gratia Rex Anglorum, shows that multiple words in table A have a customary connection to Richard. Gratia, by grace of, Rex, King, Ricardus, Angli. So we then have tile pieces that could be connected as following. Capital letters are used for extant tiles. Capital letters in italics stand for abbreviations. Lowercase letters are suggested lost letters. The slash symbol is a break between tile segments. Richard, by grace of God, the King of England. And here it reads, Ricardus Dei Gratia Rex Angliae. Another Chertsey roundel has long been identified as depicting Samson and the lion. Here he is, tearing apart the lion by opening its jaws. Samson appeared in many commentaries and gave rise to a substantial visual tradition, to which this Chertsey tile roundel belongs, which is also witnessed on objects as varied as stained glass windows, ivory game pieces, and manuscripts. As you see, some of these other objects also have inscriptions about Samson. Comparing these other inscriptions with table A, we get several words in common. Virtus Samsonis ora Leonis, Virtus Samson ora Leonis. We then have to figure out how we're going to order these words to make a phrase. Now with this roundel, we are lucky to have another kind of evidence to take into account. This is the so-called second series of Chertsey texts, which I don't have time to go into right now. Suffice it to say that the second series tile, this one, gives us important evidence as to how the words around Samson would have been ordered. We know it must have gone probably from ora, and then Leonis. So we can reconstruct the entire phrase like this. Virtus Samsonis fortis fregit ora Leonis. The courage of Samson the strong broke the jaws of the lion. So here I show you Richard and surrounding text. Here's Samson and surrounding text. Fragments surrounding, here's Samson. Here's Saladin. Fragments surrounding Saladin can be reconstructed as Saladin. However, the remaining roundels here cannot be securely identified as particular individuals. So we have to rely on different methods, but some observations can still be made. Baculo, meaning by the stick, presumably went around a roundel that shows a stick. This is the only roundel that shows a stick. I have just published an interpretation in digital philology of the 85 textual fragments in this series, reconstructing words and some phrases. The reconstructed phrases include the text surrounding the most famous roundels, as well as another series of words that you can see here. The last phrase I want to focus on, having been raised up by their victory, because that's particularly interesting. It is witnessed here in the Chertsey tiles. It's also witnessed in William of Tyre's History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea, as well as in classical texts, for instance, the commentaries on the Gallic and Alexandrine Wars. It therefore offers a clue as to the range of potential sources used by the program's designer. These phrases are not just interesting in themselves, they suggest particular sources for the tile floor, including English royal seals, widespread traditions surrounding the Old Testament figure Samson, and Latin histories of warfare. So I had hoped that I was going to have time to show you some more of the web resources, but I see we're getting close to the end of the hour, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to show you very briefly, this is what the site of Chertsey Abbey looks like now, okay? We've got a coffin and a couple stones, but this, come on, this is the reconstruction of Chertsey. And so while I read my final paragraph, I'm just going to have you look at this reconstruction, this flyover. We'll also be on view in the show. After a long process of reconstructing both the images and lost text, it became apparent that the church contained encapsulates both the essential truths of the Crusades. Graphic violence against non-Christians, and also evidence that the English, during the Crusades, relied on events and objects from the Eastern Mediterranean to characterize their own desires, history, and destiny. Although originally part of a medieval floor and the object of downcast eyes, the Chertsey tiles metaphorically suggest a raising of the gaze, an expansion of Western European horizons. Here's the combat tiles. So I close this lecture today with an open invitation to all of you. Come see the show. Bring your friends to see the show. Bring your classes to see the show. Have a look at the website and the catalog essays. Come see what we've been working on. I very much hope we'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Marta. Well, pretty impressive and intense and interesting. So, questions. I would like to have perhaps students asking questions first, because if Professor, we start and we scare them. Students perhaps first. Otherwise, I already see someone who wants to ask questions. Yes, please.
So you were talking about how they were commissioned by I understand that you were making an argument for the queen in one of your other chapters, but why, if you go into like why you think the queen would commission it, because you see like the evidence with the silk and all of the references to the Eastern world, why? And like validating the relationship to the country.
Great question. Thank you. So, repeat the question. Yes. So the question is, can I expand on my suggestion that it was the Queen, Eleanor of Provence, who commissioned these files? So it's because of an archival reason that we know that the Antioch chamber, so when we talk about the matter of Antioch in the Middle Ages, we don't just mean like the city of Antioch, we mean this big battle that took place at Antioch in the First Crusade, right before they took Jerusalem. So the matter of Antioch means crusade stuff. And the Antioch chamber
We know that the Queen commissioned for her chambers because that's what it says in the documents. So when I think about a commission from Henry and Eleanor in the royal household, this is the only one that pops up as being clearly Crusades related. So it makes sense to imagine these tiles in that room. There's no physical evidence. They have found no tiles there. But it makes sense to me to think about what we might learn if we imagine them there. And she is a really interesting character. She exchanges letters regularly with her sister, who's married to the King of France, and those two are out on crusade right at this time, right in the 1250s. And it's clear that she's really invested. She takes the cross herself, just as Henry does in the 1250s. And so I see this as her signaling her deep desire to go on crusade and her putting her husband forward as the next crusader king. Realize that if you want to go on crusade, it takes a lot of money. And to get that lot of money, you need a lot of popular support. And so I see these tiles as part of her, what sort of advertising propaganda. Hey, we're going to go out and do these great things on crusade just like Richard did. Which absolutely. Yes, that's good question. Thank you.
More questions. I have a microphone now. Yes.
Very, very simple. Thank you, Amanda. This is absolutely marvelous. Simply is that two very practical questions. How did the tiles get moved? Okay, and the other one is, in your reconstruction, what percentage of loss do you have? For example, how much is left? Thanks.
Great questions. Thank you. So it seems like it's not the tiles that move, it's the tile molds. So they are mold made, either wooden or metal molds. And so while tiles are really heavy and fragile and perhaps impractical to move, the molds are easy to move. So it seems like it's the molds that move, probably commissioned for Westminster Palace. Then they are also used in Winchester. There's a couple that are used in Winchester, and I think that's because of Winchester Palace, and there's a second Antioch chamber there. And then eventually they end up at Chertsey Abbey. So it's the molds that move. Second question, percentage of loss. Well, I'm showing you, have I got a picture still? Anything that's lost, I have a blank space. Is this gonna let me show this? Yes. So you can see what we've got. We've got, you know, for instance, the third quarter of Saladin is gone. We've got some of these letters that are gone, but anything that shows up pictorially, we have.
And the entire program, although we were very off, being the size, Chertsey Abbey, and what it originally would have been, how much do you have left? How complete the program?
I would love to know the answer, and I don't have it. And I was trying to think if there's some mathematical way to figure out, like due to the number of, you know, I've got 4 instances of this pattern and whatever. Like, could I talk to a mathematician and they can say, okay, statistically, yes, you have 10% of the original program. No, apparently you can't do that. So all I can say is we have some, unfortunately. Yeah, right.
So brilliant job. Thanks so much for your sleuthing that you've done. I suspect you're very good at Wordle and crossword puzzles and all those kinds of things. But 2 questions about that. Part of the brilliance of your presentation is the combination using different media and bringing them together. So one is just to kind of ask for an elaboration on the silk scarves that you mentioned. Could you give us a sense of how large those are first, and whether you have any examples that also include text, or whether that's something that's new and unique to the floor tiles? And then the second question has to do, in the reconstruction, you showed 2 panels of 12 roundels, it seemed, and then there were other kind of diagonal patterns interspersed, and that was part of the last video as well from the Chertsey Abbey reconstruction. And seeing it, it looked to be very similar to cosmatesque marble flooring that you find throughout churches all over Italy and other places in Europe. And so I was wondering whether you speculate that there's any cross utilization of the aesthetic from that marble flooring methods with the tiles that were created for these spaces.
Wonderful questions. Thank you so much. So the silks, roundel-based silks were often used not just as garments, but also for interior decoration. You would hang them behind an altar, for instance. We've got records that say we've got twin pieces of imported silkwood hanging behind the altar. The scale is similar to the Chertsey tiles. The Chertsey tiles are like dinner plate size, and the roundels are often that size, although sometimes you get smaller and sometimes you get quite a bit bigger. In terms of text, yes, absolutely. You sometimes get text in that circular field. You sometimes get Arabic script in that circular field if it's made in an Islamic region. So yes, the parallels I think are really nice. In terms of, just a little bit lit here, connections to cosmetic pavement, I went off on a whole other like rabbit hole investigation when I was trying to think about how to put this together, because Henry III in Westminster Abbey also commissioned a cosmetic pavement. You may well know about this, indeed. And it's gorgeous, it's precious stone. That's one of the differences. So this is made of ceramic in different shapes. The one in Westminster Abbey is gorgeous marbles and stuff like that. And I think that Henry and Eleanor are fascinated by the potential that floors have to evoke, be it expensive materials or less expensive materials, to evoke cosmopolitan connections, to evoke sense of past empires, to evoke other worlds. So although I don't see a specific work and specific pattern connection to the cosmetic floors, I do think that the overarching idea that we can do really creative things with floors, why don't we try, is absolutely really current for these patrons in this time. Thank you.
More questions?
I have a question from the Zoom. It's just, can you tell us a little bit about what cosmetic means? This is a question from the.
Oh, well, cosmetic marble. So.
What is cosmetic marble?
It's a way of putting a floor together that is very popular in medieval Italy, Rome, and other locations. And you have geometric shapes, circles, squares, big and small, and you take a lot of time and energy in putting them together in really beautiful ways. And sometimes they have much larger implications about like the way the universe is set up and celestial hierarchies and stuff like that. And yeah, they're a big, beautiful, expensive deal, especially in Italy, and then you see it in England.
More questions? Yes.
So I was wondering, like, what are the different historical references you had to use in order to like identify the different like individuals on the tile? You know, how were you able to know that that was Richard and Suleiman and just like was it a matter of like translating the Latin first, or was it a matter of identifying them first and then kind of contextualizing that?
Thank you so much for asking that. In fact, it's the latter thing you said, identifying them first. And in fact, it was not I who identified the identities of these individuals. They've been known in scholarship for 150 years, and people have gone through all the little bits and pieces of evidence. So we know that this is Richard the Lionheart because he has a shield that has 3 lions on it. And he is involved in a crusading battle. And so when you add those things together, you're like, oh, King of England, Richard the Lionheart. And Saladin is the one who is shown opposite him. Samson, we know because there's a lot of other images of Samson doing exactly this thing with the lion. In fact, I went through hundreds and hundreds of images of Samson, and I found there's all these different subgroups. So this is the one where he jumps on the lion as if he's riding a horse. And that was particularly common in northern England, northern Europe and France. These others, it's interesting, they don't seem to represent particular individuals, or if they do, no one's been able to figure out which individuals they represent. That's interesting, because they could be particular people, like this could be Gawain, who hangs out with a lion. This could be Alexander the Great. I didn't even use this one. This one's a classically inspired piece. Yes, absolutely. It's very clear that the artist is interested in showing someone with a toga, with bare feet, with curly ringlets in his hair. So maybe this is Alexander the Great, but there's no firm evidence linking them there. So it was iconography, the images themselves first, and then putting the text together afterwards. And in terms of it's actually functionally how to do that, there are these amazing image databases like the Index of Medieval Art, where you can put in guy riding a lion and get like 1,050 hits, and then you just sort through all of them and you're like, that's like it, that's not like it, that's not like it.
And if I may add something regarding this question, your questions, a possible source would be, for example, manuscripts where illustrations are, and the same picture would be represented in a page of an old manuscript. As a matter of fact, I found that same thing or a similar one in an English manuscript. So that's why you know that that is Richard. Same goes for Samson and so forth and so on. So, yeah.
The question has to do with the goal.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Do we know that Richard and Saladin were opposed to each other?
Well, they were on opposite sides in the Third Crusade.
No.
Oh, do we know that they were placed in opposition? No,
Because they were,
because
because of the angle of the lines.
I know.
The two
now, one of the difficulties in reconstructing this is that I'm reconstructing basically for a PowerPoint slide that people view from top to bottom. This was actually a floor. And so the idea of orientation on a floor is always going to be weird, like there isn't like a top and a bottom. So my sense is that these were all kind of rotated. They weren't all, you know, like set in the way that I set them here for legibility. So, well, your point is exactly right. And I made that too. There's no way to spin them so that they actually connect. I think in the actual floor, that would not have been a problem because we're moving, we're navigating, there isn't a single prescribed way to encounter that landscape. And I do see it in a landscape.
So I mean, that's a very famous, you see those in manuscripts.
Yes.
And it's a very, and they are the two guys. But they are in one form.
Yeah, no, because here, yeah, you can't mess it up. Yeah, thank you.
More questions? Anyone? Yes?
How do you anticipate that like this work and these technologies are gonna change kind of art rediscovery in the future? Kind of if you've taken these traditional, very famous tiles and you've kind of added a new spin on them with new technologies and you've given it a new story and new life. Do you kind of anticipate that's going to be a big thing in the space moving forward, that some older works are going to have kind of new stories to them?
Absolutely. What a lovely question. Yes. I mean, I'm an art historian, but science is amazing. Computer is amazing, right? Technology is amazing. There are so many more things now that we can learn that we were not able to learn 100, even 50, even 20 years ago. So yes, it's all happening. Thank you.
I just have kind of a simple question, but I know you mentioned you worked with the British Museum. Could you just explain what it was like working with them and how they kind of contributed to your research?
Sure, that's a nice question.
And also, perhaps since there are many students here, you mentioned that you work with students here at Holy Cross. So how does that work? How do you involve students working with faculty?
All right.
Yes, right?
So first question is, what was it like working with the British Museum? I want to say you have to build in a very long lag time. Email them a year and a half before you want anything, and email again and again and again, but you know, you're just overloaded. So they were lovely once they realized that I was serious and that we had the time to work together and so on. They made space for me for a week in the summer of 2017. They set me up in their storage room, which I have to say, it's the new storage facility of the British Museum. It was super James Bondy and it had like just opened, but to the degree it was so new that like the elevators weren't working. Stuff like that. A lot of the stuff was still packaged up. So I was not allowed to handle the tiles, which I think is probably a good thing. They brought me all the tiles. I photographed them. I chatted with them over lunch. Then I went home and did my thing and then presented them, hey, isn't this, you know, fabulous and amazing? And they thankfully agreed to get this fabulous and amazing. They would loan their stuff, which is what they're going to do. Working with students. So there's no way that I would have accomplished either the whole Chertsey tile reconstruction or this whole exhibition if I had not had the chance to work with students. And let me give some examples. So the textual reconstruction is something that I worked with Professor Neil Smith in classes and then also a student. And she was the one who found textual comparandi and figured out exactly how to run the programming. Like I don't program like I maybe could if I took a year off and learned how to do it. I don't know how to do it. So, you know, I said, here's my problem. And she went and figured out, consulting with Professor Smith, how to solve it. The images, I worked a ton with Janice Gay-Murray in the library, but also the person who actually took the hundreds of photographs that I took and then, you know, cut along the edges of every tile. That was a student who did the time and energy and patience to do that. And then more recently in, let's see if I can pull this up very briefly. In my seminars, last fall seminar and this semester's seminar, Andy, are you there? Have we got a master question? So this is the website we're building. And again, I don't know how to build websites. It's largely been Brooke Hendershot, who was my Weiss Summer Fellow, who put all this stuff together for me. And there are a number of features. Is this going to let me navigate? Oh, you're in the middle. You X out. There we go. All right, so there's a lot of information on this website about the Chertsey tiles and the inscriptions and everything. But the bit that I've worked most heavily with students is this part, all the objects that are coming. Students have been doing very close guided research into these objects. And we've put it on this site, which I think is really kind of fun. So you can explore everything by location, by material, through these different lists. So you can look, say you want to find out, oh, well, what have we got that's coming that's ceramic or metal or textile, stone, ivory. So for instance, ceramic. And so each of these is a small cluster of websites. Yeah, this one. So my student Grace Morrissey made this one in my seminar last year. Oh, that's Mary's. In any case, I had a couple Lusterware bowls. Both of these bowls we also got scanned by the Worcester Art Museum. So you can play with them. We're gonna have interactives in the show where you can just sort of play with the bowl and like get a good understanding of what it looks like, et cetera, et cetera. The lighting's here, not great, so that didn't help. And each of my students, they do a bunch of research about the object. And so there are questions on each of these. What is this? When was it made? How does it connect to the Crusades? And then each student also records a short video in the Holy Cross.
Hi, my name is Mary Powell, and I am a student at the College of the Holy Cross. The object I studied is the bowl.
I'm not going to play the whole thing, but we have 12 of these. We're going to have another 12 from my seminar students this fall. And I think it's just a really lovely individual view as to what makes each object interesting and relevant to the broad themes of the show. Thank you.
More questions? Well, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. So just make sure you won't miss the exhibition next fall and
Spring.
spring,
January 26th is the
Exactly.
opening, January 26th.
and perhaps next Mars event in the spring as well. So thank you for coming.